The wind had teeth that night. It came down from the mountains like a predator, cold and hungry, ripping through the valley with a sound that made grown men check their doors twice. In the darkness of Thunder Basin, where the land stretched flat and merciless under a moonless sky, a woman knelt by a frozen creek. Her name was Margaret Sullivan, though most folks called her Maggie when they called her anything at all. She was 60 years old, give or take, with hands that had forgotten softness decades ago. Those hands gripped a hammer now, swinging it down against the ice with a desperation that came from somewhere deeper than cold, deeper than fear. The ice cracked, then shattered. Dark water rushed up through the hole, bitter and black. Blood dripped from her knuckles where the skin had split. She didn't seem to notice. Her eyes, green as spring grass in a land that hadn't seen spring in months, were fixed on something beneath the surface. A shape. A wooden case, small enough to carry, heavy enough to sink. Behind her, perhaps a quarter-mile back through the cottonwoods, flames painted the night sky orange. Her house was burning. The house where she'd lived for 30 years. The house where her daughter had died. The house where her husband had made her life a kind of slow murder. Maggie's breath came in ragged clouds. Her fingers closed around the case's handle. She pulled. The water fought her, reluctant to give up what it had claimed, but Maggie Sullivan had been fighting all her life, and she was good at it. The case came free with a sound like a gasp. She didn't look back at the fire. She already knew there was nothing left worth saving. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper that the wind tried to steal. A confession to the empty night, or perhaps to God, if he was listening, if he cared. "They'll say I killed him for the land," she said. "They don't know I killed him to stay alive." The words hung in the frozen air for a moment, then vanished like smoke. 3 months earlier, autumn had come to Wyoming territory with a gentleness that felt like betrayal. The sky was that particular shade of blue that painters spend their whole lives trying to capture and never quite manage. The aspens on the mountain slopes burned gold and crimson, beautiful as a lie. Market day in Casper brought everyone out. Ranchers and homesteaders, merchants and drifters, women in their Sunday best, and children running wild between the wagons. The main street filled with the smell of livestock and fresh bread, with the sound of bartering and laughter and the occasional curse when a deal went sour. Maggie stood behind her stall near the church selling butter and cheese she'd made herself. The butter was good, rich, and yellow. The cheese was better. She'd learned the craft from her mother back in Ohio before the world had taught her what it really meant to be a woman alone. She wasn't alone then, of course. She'd had Frank, her husband. Though by the end, he was more like a storm she'd learned to predict, a violence she'd learned to survive. But Frank was 2 years dead now, taken by the black lung that got most of the miners eventually. She'd nursed him through it, watching him drown on dry land, listening to him curse her with his last breaths for not calling the doctor sooner, for not spending money they didn't have on medicine that wouldn't have worked anyway. She told people she'd done everything she could. She almost believed it herself. A shadow fell across her table. Maggie looked up, already forming her shopkeeper's smile, the one that said, "Welcome, buy something, then leave me alone." The smile died before it reached her lips. The man standing before her was tall. Not unusually so, but tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He wore a dark coat, well made, the kind that cost real money. His hat was black felt, expensive. His face was weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, but there was something else there too, something careful, controlled. His eyes were blue, not sky blue or summer blue, but the blue of deep water, the kind that drowns you if you're not careful. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "I'm James Holloway." She knew the name. Everyone in Thunder Basin knew the name. Holloway Cattle Company, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land. Hundreds of head of cattle. The kind of wealth that made small ranchers like her irrelevant. "I know who you are," Maggie said. Her voice came out colder than she'd intended, but she didn't soften it. "What do you want?" "I want to talk business. I'm not selling. I haven't made an offer yet. Don't bother." Something flickered in those blue eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. Men like James Holloway weren't used to being dismissed, especially not by women, especially not by women who sold butter at market stalls. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, and this time there was an edge to his voice, sharp as a knife's spine. "You have water rights on Sullivan Creek, the creek that runs through your property and down into the valley. My cattle need that water. Then they should have been born somewhere else. I'm offering fair payment, $100 a month for access rights through the winter." $100. Maggie felt her stomach clench. That was more money than she'd seen in months, more than she'd make selling butter for a year. It was enough to pay down her debt to the bank, maybe even buy seed for spring planting. It was also nowhere near what the water was actually worth. "No," she said. Holloway's jaw tightened. "200. I said no. Mrs. Sullivan, be reasonable." "I am being reasonable. My answer is no. The water is mine. The land is mine. And neither one is for sale, lease, or rent to you or anyone else." People were starting to stare. Maggie could feel their eyes like insects crawling on her skin. In a small town, a public argument was entertainment, gossip, and social currency all rolled into one. Holloway must have felt it too, because his voice dropped even lower. "You're 3 months from losing everything. The bank will take your land if you can't make your payments." "That's my concern. Winter's coming. You can't run that ranch alone." "I've been running it alone for 2 years. And it's killing you." The words landed like a slap. Maggie's hands tightened on the table edge, not from fear, from rage, from the terrible truth of what he'd said. She clenched her fists to stop the shaking. "Get away from my stall." For a long moment, Holloway just looked at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger, something sadder, something that looked almost like recognition. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it might have been courteous if it hadn't felt like mockery. "Pride doesn't fill a stomach, Mrs. Sullivan. Winter is coming whether you're ready or not." He turned and walked away. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone. Maggie stood there, hands still clenched, feeling the weight of every eye on her, feeling the weight of her own stubbornness pressing down like a hand on her chest. She reached for the jar of butter she'd been holding. Her fingers slipped. The jar fell. It shattered on the hard, packed earth, yellow butter mixing with dirt and broken glass. Before she could move, before she could even process the loss, someone knelt beside her stall. Holloway. He'd come back. He picked up the largest piece of the jar carefully, then set it on her table like it was something precious. "I'm not your enemy," he said quietly. Only she could hear him now. "But winter is." Then he was gone again, disappearing into the crowd. Maggie stared at the broken glass, at the ruined butter, at her hands, still shaking. She told herself it was anger. She almost believed it. The ride back to Sullivan Ranch took 2 hours. 2 hours of Maggie alone with her thoughts, which was 2 hours too long. The land stretched out around her in shades of brown and gold, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful just before they die. The creek ran alongside the road for part of the journey, its water clear and cold, rushing over stones that had been there since before people gave this place a name. That creek was the reason Frank had chosen this land 30 years ago. Water meant life in a place like Wyoming. It meant survival. It meant power. It also meant that men like James Holloway would never leave her alone. Her horse, a bay mare named Rosie, picked her way carefully over the rough ground. Maggie let her find her own pace. Her mind was elsewhere, caught in a loop of anger and calculation. $200 a month. For 6 months of winter, that would be $1,200, more than enough to pay off her debt to the bank, more than enough to survive until spring. But it would also mean giving Holloway control. Men like him didn't stop at water rights. They pushed and pushed until they owned everything, until you were just a tenant on your own land, a ghost in your own life. She'd lived like that once already. She wouldn't do it again. The house came into view as she crested the last hill, small, wooden, weathered gray by sun and wind. The barn beside it leaned slightly to the left, its roof patched with mismatched boards. Beyond that, the pasture where her 8 remaining cows grazed, thin as wishes. 8 cows. She'd had 20 when Frank died. 12 had been lost to disease, predators, and her own inability to afford proper feed. 8 cows couldn't sustain a ranch, could barely sustain one person. But they were hers, the land was hers, and she'd be damned if she'd give any of it up without a fight. Maggie dismounted, her knees protesting. 60 years old, and some mornings she felt twice that. She led Rosie to the barn, unsaddled her, gave her hay and water. The familiar routine was soothing, a meditation of muscle memory. When she finally walked to the house, the sun was setting. The sky bled red and purple, apocalyptic and gorgeous. Inside, the house was cold. It was always cold now. She couldn't afford enough wood to keep the stove burning all day, so she rationed heat like medicine, using it only when necessary. She lit a lamp, made tea with leaves she'd used twice already, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the wall. On the wall was a photograph, herself, younger, Frank, smiling, and between them a little girl with dark curls and Maggie's green eyes. Sarah, her daughter. Dead at 2 years old, taken by a disease that might have been cured if they'd had money for a real doctor, instead of the traveling medicine man who'd given them syrup that tasted like hope and did nothing at all. Frank had blamed her for not seeing the signs sooner, for not insisting they find money somehow, for loving their daughter but not enough to save her. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe she could have done something different. Maybe. The maybes would kill you if you let them. Maggie pulled her gaze away from the photograph, looked down at her hands instead. They were shaking again. Not anger this time, not entirely. Fear. She was afraid of the winter, of the bank, of being alone, of dying alone, unmourned, forgotten. Her body found weeks later by someone who'd come to claim the land. She was afraid of James Holloway and his cold blue eyes and his offers that sounded like help but felt like chains. Most of all, she was afraid that she was too tired to keep fighting. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Maggie stood so quickly her chair scraped back. Her hand went automatically to the rifle mounted above the doorframe. In Wyoming territory, you didn't open your door after dark without being ready for whatever came through it. "Who is it?" she called. "James Holloway." Her heart stuttered. She hadn't expected this. Not here, not now. "Go away. I need to talk to you." "We talked." "Not about this." Maggie's fingers tightened around the rifle. She could just not answer, wait for him to leave, but something in his voice made her hesitate. He didn't sound angry. He sounded exhausted. She opened the door, kept the rifle visible. "Make it quick." Holloway stood on her porch, hat in his hands. Up close, in the lamplight spilling from the doorway, she could see details she'd missed at the market. The lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the weariness that sat on his shoulders like a coat he couldn't take off. "I have a proposal," he said. "Hear me out before you shoot me." "I'm listening." He took a breath, then another, like he was working up courage for something. "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Maggie stared at him. "You're insane." "I'm desperate, and so are you. Get off my property." "Listen to me, please." He held up his hands, placating. "A marriage of convenience. 1 year. We combine our resources. Your water rights, my cattle, my capital, your land. Together we survive the winter. We pay off our debts. And after a year, if we want to end it, we split everything equally and go our separate ways." "Why would you possibly want that?" "Because I'm about to lose everything, too." The confession came out harsh, like it hurt. "I mortgaged my ranch last year to expand my herd. I bet on rain. We got drought. If I can't keep my cattle alive through winter, the bank takes everything. I need your water. You need my money. It's simple math. It's insane. It's survival. Maggie's mind was reeling. Marriage. To a stranger. To a man who probably saw her as just another asset to acquire, another problem to solve. But he was right about one thing. She was desperate. 3 months from foreclosure. 3 months from losing the land she'd bled for, the land that held the bones of her daughter's memory, the land that was the only proof she'd existed at all. No, she said, but her voice was weaker than she wanted it to be. Holloway heard it. Think about it. You don't have to answer now. I'm answering now. No. Then we both lose. You, me, and Cornelius Drake wins. The name made Maggie's blood freeze. What does Drake have to do with this? He wants both our properties. Railroad's coming through next year. He knows it. If we fail, he buys our land for pennies and sells to the railroad for thousands. Drake, Cornelius Drake, who owned the bank, who smiled like a snake and talked like a preacher and had the soul of a carrion bird. How do you know about the railroad? Maggie asked. Because Drake offered to forgive my debt if I sold to him. He said I'd be doing myself a favor. Getting out before winter killed me. Holloway's expression was grim. He made you an offer too, didn't he? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. We're not the only ones, Holloway continued. He's been buying up land all along the proposed route, using debt as a weapon, foreclosure as a tool, and if we don't do something, we'll be next. Maggie's mind raced. It made sense. Horrible? Perfect sense. Drake had been circling her property for months, always friendly, always offering help that came with strings attached. Why should I trust you? She asked. You could be working with him. If I was working with Drake, I'd just wait for you to lose your land and buy it from the bank. I wouldn't be standing on your porch asking you to marry me. It was a fair point. Maggie hated that it was a fair point. What would this marriage look like, she asked, hating herself for even considering it. A business arrangement, separate bedrooms, no expectations beyond the partnership. We work together, we survive together, and if we can't stand each other after a year, we part as equals. And if I say no, then I'll leave, and we'll both lose everything, and Drake will win. The lamplight flickered. A gust of wind rattled the windows. Winter was indeed coming. Maggie could feel it in her bones, cold and patient and inevitable. She looked at James Holloway, really looked at him, saw past the expensive coat and the proud bearing to the desperation underneath. He was telling the truth. He was as trapped as she was. Maybe that made him trustworthy, or maybe it just made him predictable. I need time to think, she said. You have until morning. After that, I'm making other arrangements. He put his hat back on. Tipped it to her, that same old-fashioned gesture. Then he walked to his horse, mounted up, and rode away into the darkness. Maggie stood in her doorway long after he'd gone. The night was very dark, the stars were very bright, and somewhere out there winter was sharpening its teeth. She closed the door, locked it, sat back down at the kitchen table. Her tea had gone cold. She drank it anyway. She looked at the photograph on the wall again. Sarah, her baby girl, frozen forever at 2 years old, forever innocent, forever dead. What should I do? Maggie whispered to the photograph. The photograph didn't answer. The dead never did. But somewhere in her memory, she heard Sarah laughing. That pure, unself-conscious joy that children had before the world taught them to be careful, before the world taught them that love was dangerous and trust was foolish and survival meant closing your heart like a fist. Maggie had married Frank for love. She'd been 17 and he'd been handsome, and he'd promised her a life of adventure and freedom. What she'd gotten instead was 30 years of slow suffocation, of being reshaped and diminished until she barely recognized herself. What if this time she married for survival instead? What if she went into it with clear eyes and no illusions? Would that be better, or just a different kind of death? She didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table watching the lamp burn lower and lower, counting the reasons to say yes and the reasons to say no. By the time dawn broke, gray and cold, she'd made her decision. She saddled Rosie with numb fingers, rode toward Holloway Ranch as the sun climbed higher, turning the frost on the grass into diamonds. The Holloway place was everything hers wasn't. The house was large, 2 stories, painted white, with a wide porch. The barn was massive, in good repair, surrounded by corrals full of horses. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing, hundreds of them, their breath making clouds in the cold air. This was wealth. This was security. This was everything she'd never had. It could be hers, for a price. A man emerged from the barn as she approached. Not Holloway. Someone older, harder, with a face like weathered leather. "Help you?" he asked. "I'm here to see Mr. Holloway." "He expecting you?" "Yes." The man studied her with eyes that missed nothing. Then he nodded toward the house. "He's inside." Maggie dismounted, tied Rosie to the porch rail, climbed the steps with her heart hammering like it was trying to escape her chest. She knocked. The door opened almost immediately. Holloway stood there, still in his work clothes, looking like he'd slept as poorly as she had. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'll do it," she said before she could change her mind. "I'll marry you, on 2 conditions. Name them." "1. I want it in writing. A contract that says exactly what we're agreeing to. Property division, duration, terms of separation. Everything legal." "Agreed." "And the second condition?" Maggie met his eyes, held his gaze, let him see the steel underneath her exhaustion. "If you ever raise your hand to me, I'll kill you." For a long moment Holloway just looked at her. Then slowly, something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or respect. "Fair enough," he said. "When do you want to do this?" "Soon as possible, before I change my mind. There's a judge in Casper who owes me a favor. We could be married by this afternoon." This afternoon. In a few hours she would become Margaret Holloway. She would give up her name, her independence, her solitude, all for a chance at survival. All because she was too tired and too afraid to keep fighting alone. "All right," she said, "come inside. We'll work out the details." She followed him into the house. It was warm inside, almost shockingly so after the cold of her own home. The furniture was good quality. The floors were polished. The windows were clean. But there was something hollow about it. Like a museum of a life rather than a life itself. They sat at a dining table that could have seated 12. Holloway pulled out paper and pen, and together they drafted their contract. Water rights, land ownership, division of profits, terms of separation. It was businesslike, efficient, completely devoid of anything resembling romance or warmth. When they were done, Maggie read it over 3 times, made Holloway change 2 clauses, then signed her name at the bottom. Margaret Ann Sullivan, soon to be Margaret Ann Holloway. "I'll arrange everything," Holloway said. "We'll leave at noon. I need to pack. Of course, I'll have Gideon escort you home and back." "Gideon?" "My foreman, the man you met outside." "I don't need an escort." "Humor me. Winter's coming, and there are desperate men on the roads." Maggie wanted to argue, but she was too tired. "Fine." She stood. Holloway stood too. They faced each other across the table, 2 people about to bind their lives together without knowing anything about each other except that they were both drowning and hoping the other person knew how to swim. "Mrs. Sullivan," Holloway said, "I want you to know I'll honor every word of that contract. I won't ask for anything beyond what we've agreed to. See that you don't." She walked out. Gideon was waiting with the horses. The ride back to Sullivan Ranch was silent. Gideon didn't seem inclined to talk, and Maggie was grateful for it. Her mind was too full of second thoughts and third thoughts, and the growing certainty that she was making a terrible mistake. But what choice did she have? Starve alone or survive together? Die proud or live humbled? There were no good choices, only less terrible ones. At her house, she packed quickly. 1 trunk, that was all she'd need. Clothes, a few books, the photograph of Sarah. Everything else could stay or burn or rot. It didn't matter. She was almost done when she remembered the letters. They were in a tin box under the floorboards of her bedroom, hidden there for years. Letters from Frank. Letters he'd written during their courtship, full of promises and poetry and lies. There was one letter in particular, the last one he'd written before they married. She'd never opened it, had been too afraid of what it might say, what it might change. She pulled it out now, looked at her name written in Frank's careful hand, thought about opening it, about finally knowing what he'd wanted to say. Then she lit the stove, fed the letter to the flames. Some secrets were better left buried. By noon, she was back at Holloway Ranch. Gideon helped her unload her trunk without comment, though she saw him glance at how small it was, how little of a life could fit inside. Holloway emerged from the house dressed in a dark suit. He looked uncomfortable in it, like a wild animal forced into a cage. "Ready?" he asked. Maggie nodded. She didn't trust her voice. They rode to Casper together. The town was busy with afternoon traffic. No one paid them any attention, just another couple going about their business. The judge's office was small and smelled like old paper. Judge Warren was an elderly man with kind eyes and a knowing smile. "Jim," he said, shaking Holloway's hand, "I was surprised to get your message. Didn't think you'd ever marry again after Rebecca." Something flickered across Holloway's face. Pain, quickly masked. "Life is full of surprises," he said. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. They signed papers, exchanged vows that felt like legal testimony. The judge said they could kiss, and Holloway just shook his head. "That won't be necessary," he said. The judge looked confused, but didn't push. He signed the marriage certificate, made it official. Just like that, Maggie was married again, for the second time in her life, and this time without even the illusion of love to soften it. They rode back to Holloway Ranch in silence as the sun set. The temperature dropped. The wind picked up. Winter was indeed coming. At the house, Holloway showed her to a bedroom on the second floor. It was large, well furnished, with a bed that looked softer than anything she'd slept on in years. "This is yours," he said. "My room is at the other end of the hall. Bathroom is next door. Lucia, the housekeeper, will bring you anything you need." "Lucia? She's worked here for 10 years. Good woman. You can trust her." Maggie wondered if that was true. Wondered if she could trust anyone in this house, including the man she'd just married. "Thank you," she said, because she didn't know what else to say. Holloway nodded, started to leave, then paused at the door. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. The name sounded strange, wrong. "I know this isn't what either of us wanted, but I meant what I said. I'll honor our agreement. You're safe here." Safe. What a strange word. What a complicated promise. "Good night, Mr. Holloway," she said. He left, closing the door softly behind him. Maggie stood in the middle of her new bedroom, in her new house, in her new life. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the silence was absolute. She sat on the bed, put her face in her hands, and for the first time in years, Margaret Sullivan Holloway cried. Not because she was sad, not because she regretted her choice, but because she was so tired of being strong, and this man she barely knew had promised she didn't have to be. At least, not alone. Tomorrow, they would figure out how to survive together. Tomorrow, they would learn if this desperate gamble would save them or destroy them. But tonight, for the first time in years, Maggie fell asleep in a warm room, in a soft bed, with the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. And if that made her weak, then so be it. She'd been strong long enough. The first morning of her new life began before dawn. Maggie woke to darkness so complete she didn't know where she was. Her heart hammered against her ribs, panic rising like floodwater. Then memory returned. The marriage, the contract, the decision that couldn't be undone. She was in James Holloway's house now, in a bedroom that cost more than her entire ranch, married to a man she didn't know and didn't trust, bound by necessity and desperation and the cold mathematics of survival. She dressed quickly in the dark, unwilling to light a lamp and announce her wakefulness. The clothes she'd brought were worn, patched in places but clean. She'd been poor long enough to know that dignity wasn't about what you wore, but how you wore it. When she opened her bedroom door, the hallway was silent. Somewhere in this house, James Holloway was sleeping, or perhaps he was awake too, lying in his own bed, wondering what he'd done. Maggie made her way downstairs. The house was different in the pre-dawn darkness, unfamiliar and slightly menacing. Shadows pooled in corners. The floorboards creaked under her feet like accusations. She found the kitchen by instinct and memory. It was large, well-equipped, with a stove that probably cost more than she'd made in a year selling butter. A lamp was already burning on the table. A woman stood at the counter, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. She looked up when Maggie entered. Her face was round, kind, weathered brown by sun and years, perhaps 40, perhaps 50. Age was hard to judge in women who worked with their hands. "Mrs. Holloway," the woman said. Her voice carried the soft music of Spanish underneath English words. "I am Lucia Morales. Welcome." "Thank you." Maggie hesitated at the threshold, unsure of her place in this house. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." No, I rise early. Old habit." Lucia gestured to a chair. "Please, sit. I make coffee." Maggie sat, watched Lucia work. There was something soothing about the woman's movements, the quiet competence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. "You have worked here long?" Maggie asked. 10 years since my husband passed." Lucia poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug, set it before Maggie. "Mr. Holloway is a good man, fair, you will see." The words felt like a warning and a reassurance both. Maggie wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. "His first wife," Maggie said carefully. "Rebecca, what was she like?" Lucia's hands stilled on the bread dough. For a moment she didn't answer. When she did, her voice was soft, sad. "Beautiful, very young. 22 when she came here. She loved Mr. Holloway very much. Too much, maybe." "What do you mean?" Lucia looked at Maggie, weighing something. Then she seemed to decide. She wanted a child desperately. Mr. Holloway, too. When she finally became pregnant, it was like all the prayers had been answered. Lucia's hands resumed kneading, but slower now. But the birth, it went wrong. The baby was turned. The doctor said Mr. Holloway had to choose, save the mother or try to save the baby. Maggie's chest tightened. She knew where this story was going, had known the moment Lucia began. Mrs. Rebecca, before she went into labor, she made Mr. Holloway promise. If it came to choosing, he must save the baby. She said she could not live knowing she let her child die to save herself. Lucia's voice cracked slightly. He honored her wish. He chose the baby, and they both died anyway. Mother and daughter both, within an hour of each other. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a rooster crowed. Dawn was coming. "He has not touched the nursery since," Lucia continued, "has not spoken of Rebecca except once on the anniversary of her death. He went to her grave and came back different, colder, like something inside him died too." Maggie drank her coffee. It was strong, bitter, perfect. "Why are you telling me this?" Lucia met her eyes. "Because you need to know. The man you married, he is carrying a weight, a guilt that will crush him if he is not careful. And I think maybe you understand this. I think maybe you carry such a weight too." It was too perceptive, too close to truths Maggie had spent years burying. "We all carry something," Maggie said carefully. "Yes. But some of us, we learn to put it down. Others, we hold it until it kills us." Lucia shaped the dough into loaves, set them aside to rise. "I tell you this not to frighten you, but so you understand. Mr. Holloway, he will not ask for your love. He does not believe he deserves it. But if you offer kindness, he will remember it forever." Before Maggie could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Heavy, male, deliberate. James Holloway entered the kitchen dressed for work. Canvas pants, heavy shirt, boots caked with yesterday's mud. He stopped when he saw Maggie, surprise flickering across his face. "Mrs. Holloway, you're up early." Old habit. She echoed Lucia's words from earlier. He nodded, poured himself coffee, stood at the counter rather than sitting. The awkwardness between them was thick as smoke. "I thought," he said slowly, "we should discuss the work arrangement, how we'll divide responsibilities." "All right. I need to see your ranch. Assess the condition of the land, the livestock, the equipment. Then we can make a plan." "When?" "This morning, if you're willing." Maggie set down her mug. "I'm willing." They rode out after breakfast. The sun was just clearing the mountains, turning the frost on the grass into fire. Their breath made clouds in the cold air. The horses' hooves struck the frozen ground with sounds like hammers on stone. Gideon Fletcher accompanied them, silent and watchful. Maggie had the sense he was evaluating her, measuring her worth. She met his gaze when he looked at her, refusing to be diminished. Sullivan Ranch looked worse than Maggie remembered. Had it always been this small, this shabby? The barn leaned drunkenly. The fences were patched with wire and prayer. The house itself seemed to crouch against the wind, beaten into submission by too many winters. Her 8 cows grazed in the pasture, ribs showing through their hides. They needed grain, medicine, care she couldn't afford. Holloway dismounted, walked the property with the careful attention of a man assessing damage. Gideon went with him, the two of them talking in low voices, pointing at things, making notes. Maggie stayed by the house. She didn't want to hear their assessment, didn't want to hear what she already knew. That her ranch was dying, that she'd been fighting a losing battle for so long she'd forgotten what victory looked like. When they returned, Holloway's face was carefully neutral. "The land is good," he said. "Water rights are valuable. But the infrastructure needs work. The barn needs to be rebuilt. The fences need replacement. The livestock need veterinary care and better feed." "I know." Maggie's voice was flat. "We'll bring your cattle to my ranch. Better grazing, better shelter. Gideon will assign some men to repair the barn and fences. By spring, this place will be operational again. And in the meantime, you live at Holloway Ranch. Work with me on the daily operations. Learn the business side of ranching, not just the labor." It was reasonable, practical, everything she'd agreed to. It also meant leaving her home, the last place she'd lived with Sarah, the last place that held any memory of who she'd been before Frank broke her. "Can I take some things from the house?" she asked. "Whatever you want." She went inside alone. The house was cold, lifeless. Dust motes hung in the air like tiny ghosts. She went to the bedroom, pulled up the loose floorboard where she'd hidden the tin box. Inside were more letters from Frank. A lock of Sarah's hair, dark and fine as silk. A small carved wooden horse that had been Sarah's favorite toy. She took the hair and the horse, left the letters. In the kitchen, she found her mother's cookbook. The pages were stained, the binding broken, but the recipes were still legible. Recipes passed down through generations, each one a small act of love. She took that too. On her way out, she paused at the door, looked back at the house one last time. This place had been her prison and her sanctuary both. She'd suffered here, survived here, become someone here, though she wasn't sure who. "Goodbye," she whispered. The house didn't answer. Houses never did. Outside, Holloway and Gideon were securing her cattle for the move. The animals were nervous, sensing change. Maggie knew how they felt. "Ready?" Holloway asked. "Yes." They rode back to Holloway Ranch with the small herd following. By the time they arrived, the sun was high. The day had warmed slightly, though winter's promise still hung in the air. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of work and adjustment. Maggie rose before dawn each day, determined to prove she wasn't a burden. She worked alongside the ranch hands, mucking stalls, mending fences, caring for livestock. Her hands, already rough, grew harder. Her back ached constantly. But she didn't complain. Holloway watched her work with an expression she couldn't read, not approval exactly, something closer to surprise, as if he'd expected her to be decorative and useless. And she kept proving him wrong. They developed a rhythm, not comfort, but routine. They ate breakfast together in silence. worked separately during the day, met in the evening to discuss ranch business over dinner that Lucia prepared, and they barely tasted. They were unfailingly polite to each other. Formal, like diplomats from warring nations forced to share a table. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things shifted. It started with small moments, Holloway holding a gate open for her, Maggie pouring him coffee without being asked, their hands brushing when they both reached for the same document, and neither pulling away quite as quickly as they might have. One evening, Maggie found Holloway in the barn, trying to coax medicine down the throat of a sick calf. The animal was fighting him, terrified and in pain. Holloway was patient but clearly struggling. "Let me," Maggie said. She knelt beside the calf, placed one hand on its neck, stroking gently, began to hum, low and soft. An old lullaby her mother had sung, the one she'd sung to Sarah. The calf's eyes rolled less wildly. Its breathing slowed. Maggie administered the medicine smoothly. The calf swallowed, coughed once, then settled. Holloway stared at her. "How did you do that?" "Animals respond to calm, to kindness." She stood, brushing hay from her skirt. Frank never understood that. He thought force was the only way. It was the first time she'd mentioned her first husband without prompting. Holloway seemed to sense the significance. "Your husband," he said carefully. "Was he cruel?" Maggie met his eyes, decided for reasons she couldn't articulate to tell the truth. "Yes." One word. But it held 30 years of fear and pain and survival. Holloway's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He's dead. I'm alive. That's enough." She walked out of the barn before he could respond, before the conversation could go deeper than she could handle. But later that night, she found a new lock on her bedroom door, a good one, solid and strong, and a note in careful handwriting. "So you always feel safe." She didn't thank him, didn't mention it, but that night she locked her door and slept more soundly than she had in years. The weather turned colder. The first real snow came in early November, blanketing the valley in white silence. The ranch slowed its pace, adjusting to winter rhythms. One afternoon, Maggie was in the kitchen with Lucia, learning to make the spiced stew that the ranch hands loved. Lucia was patient, correcting Maggie's technique without criticism. "You are good at this," Lucia said. "Cooking, I mean. You have the feel for it." "My mother taught me, before I married Frank and moved west." Maggie stirred the pot, watching steam rise. "She said a woman who could cook would never starve. I think she was wrong, but I learned anyway." Lucia laughed softly. "My mother said the same thing. Maybe all mothers are wrong in the same ways." They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then Lucia said quietly, "May I ask you something personal, Senora?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Do you regret it, marrying Mr. Holloway?" Maggie considered the question, considered lying, decided against it. "I don't know yet. Ask me in spring. That is honest, at least. It's all I have." Lucia nodded, understanding. "He is lonely, you know. Mr. Holloway has been for 5 years, since Rebecca died. Maybe longer, maybe his whole life. We're all lonely. Yes, but some loneliness can be fixed. Some can be shared, made lighter, and some it just grows and grows until it swallows everything." Before Maggie could respond, the kitchen door burst open. Gideon stood there, snow-covered, face grim. "Mrs. Holloway, we have a problem." Maggie's stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" 50 head of cattle are missing. North pasture fence was cut, clean cuts, not an accident." The warmth of the kitchen suddenly felt very far away. "Where's Mr. Holloway?" Maggie asked. "Out tracking. He wants you to stay here." "Like hell." Maggie grabbed her coat. Lucia tried to protest, but Maggie was already moving. Outside, the world was white and gray. The wind had teeth. She found her horse, saddled it with numb fingers, and followed Gideon's tracks north. She found Holloway at the fence line. He was standing in the snow, staring at the cut wire. His face was carefully blank, but his hands were clenched into fists. "I told Gideon you should stay at the house," he said without turning. "I don't take orders well." He almost smiled. Almost. "I'm learning that." Maggie dismounted, examined the fence. The cuts were clean, deliberate, made with proper wire cutters, not torn by animals or weather. "Someone did this on purpose," she said. "Yes? Drake? Probably. Or someone he hired." Holloway's voice was flat. "The tracks lead toward town but disappear at the creek. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. How many head did we lose?" 50, maybe more. We won't know until we do a full count." He turned to face her finally. "This is bad, Margaret. 50 head represents thousands of dollars, money we need to pay the bank." It was the first time he'd called her by her given name. The intimacy of it felt strange, wrong, and somehow right all at once. "We go to town," Maggie said. "We confront Drake. We have no proof. We have cut wire and missing cattle." "Which proves nothing. Drake is careful. He'll have alibis, witnesses, legal documents that say he was nowhere near here." "So we do nothing?" Holloway's eyes were ice. "I didn't say that." They rode to Casper the next morning. The town was busy with pre-winter preparations. Merchants sold supplies at inflated prices. Cowboys drank away their summer wages. Children played in the street, oblivious to adult concerns. The bank stood at the center of town, brick and imposing, a monument to money and power. Cornelius Drake's office was on the second floor. His secretary, a pinched woman with suspicious eyes, tried to turn them away. "Mr. Drake is very busy." "Tell him the Holloways are here," James said. His voice carried the weight of old money, old power. "He'll see us." The secretary disappeared, returned moments later, tight-lipped. "Mr. Drake will see you, briefly." Drake's office was everything the man himself was, polished, expensive, coldly elegant. He sat behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. His suit was immaculate. His smile was practiced. "Mr. Holloway, and the new Mrs. Holloway. What a pleasant surprise." The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Congratulations on your marriage." "Quite sudden, wasn't it?" "We're not here for social calls," James said. 50 head of my cattle are missing. Someone cut my fence." Drake's expression was all concern. Completely false. "How terrible. Have you contacted the sheriff?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." "Me? Whatever for?" "Because you offered to buy my land 2 months ago. You told me winter would do your work for you." Drake's smile widened. "Mr. Holloway, surely you're not suggesting I had something to do with your missing cattle? That's quite an accusation." "It's not an accusation. It's a fact." "Do you have proof?" "Not yet." "Then I'm afraid we have nothing to discuss." Drake stood, signaling the meeting's end. "I'm a banker, not a cattle rustler. If you have evidence of wrongdoing, present it to the sheriff. Otherwise, I must ask you to leave." Maggie, who had been silent until now, spoke. Her voice was quiet, but carried an edge sharp as broken glass. "How much did the railroad offer you, Mr. Drake?" Drake's smile froze, just for a moment, just long enough to confirm what she'd suspected. "I don't know what you mean." "The railroad. The one coming through next year? The one whose route happens to go right through our properties." Maggie stepped closer to his desk. "How much are they paying you per acre when you acquire the land cheap and sell it to them expensive?" "That's absurd." "Is it? Because it seems like every rancher along that route is suddenly having financial difficulties. Mysterious problems, lost livestock, damaged property. And you, Mr. Drake, you're always there with an offer to help, to buy them out, to save them from ruin." Drake's expression hardened. The false warmth evaporated like morning frost. "Careful, Mrs. Holloway. Accusations like that could be considered slander. Only if they're false." For a long moment Drake stared at her. Then he sat back down, steepled his fingers, and dropped all pretense of friendliness. "Let me be clear," he said. "I am a businessman. I make investments. Sometimes those investments work out in my favor. That's not a crime. That's capitalism." "And if people get hurt?" Maggie asked. "Then they should have been more careful." James moved between Maggie and the desk. "We're done here." "Indeed we are." Drake picked up a paper from his desk. "Oh, one more thing. Mr. Holloway, Your loan payment has been adjusted. What? Your contract has a variable rate clause. Given current economic conditions, your monthly payment is now $1,200, not $500. I never signed a variable rate contract. Drake turned the paper around, pushed it across the desk. Your signature is right here, witnessed and notarized. James snatched up the paper, stared at it. Maggie could see his hands beginning to shake. I didn't sign this, James said. His voice was very quiet, very dangerous. The signature says otherwise, and unless you can prove forgery, which is a serious charge to make against a respected businessman, the contract stands. They left the bank in silence, stood on the street in the cold wind, the paper clutched in James's fist. He forged your signature, Maggie said. I know. We need to prove it. How? His witnesses will swear it's legitimate. His notary will confirm. We have nothing but our word against his documentation. Maggie thought fast. We need a handwriting expert, someone who can prove the signature is fake. That costs money we don't have. And even if we could afford it, it would take weeks. We don't have weeks. He was right. Winter was closing in. Every day mattered. Every dollar mattered. Then what do we do? Maggie asked. James looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time since their marriage, she saw past his careful control to the fear underneath. I don't know, he said. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The sky had gone gray. More snow was coming. Maggie could smell it in the air, taste it on the wind. At the house they found Gideon waiting. His expression told them the news before he spoke. The count is done. 52 head missing, and 3 more dead in the east pasture. Looks like poison in the water trough. James closed his eyes. How much more can we lose before we're finished? Not much, boss. Maybe another 40, 50 head. After that, we're under the threshold. Bank can foreclose early. How many have we lost total since summer? Including today? About 100. James did the math. Maggie could see him calculating, trying to find a way forward that didn't end in ruin. There wasn't one. Double the night patrols, James said finally. Armed men on every property line. Anything suspicious, shoot first and ask questions later. That might start a war, Gideon said. We're already in a war. We just didn't know it. That night Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the house settle, listening to footsteps as men took their positions around the property, listening to winter sharpen its claws. Around midnight she heard a sound from downstairs, quiet but distinct. Someone was moving around. She rose, pulled on her robe, took the small pistol she kept under her pillow, moved silently down the stairs. The sound was coming from James's study. A light flickered under the door. Maggie pushed it open quietly. James sat at his desk, head in his hands. Papers were scattered around him, financial records, loan documents, calculations that didn't add up, no matter how many times he worked them. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were red. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning. I'm sorry, he said. Did I wake you? No, I couldn't sleep. She moved into the room, closed the door behind her. How bad is it? He laughed. It was a terrible sound, hollow and broken. We're finished. Even if we don't lose another cow, even if we have a perfect winter, we can't make the new payment. Drake wins. He always wins. Maggie sat down across from him, looked at the numbers he'd been working. He was right. The mathematics were brutal and clear. There has to be another way, she said. There isn't. I've looked. I've done the calculations 100 times. Unless we find a miracle, we lose everything in 3 months. Then we find a miracle. You don't understand. I've bet everything on this. My ranch, your land, our future. And I've lost. I'm going to lose it all, and I'm going to take you down with me. His voice cracked on the last words. Maggie realized with shock that he was crying. Silently, barely, but crying nonetheless. She didn't think. She stood, moved around the desk, and did something she'd sworn she'd never do. She touched him, put her hand on his shoulder. He flinched, then slowly leaned into the touch, like a man drowning reaching for anything solid. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I promised to save you, and I'm failing. You haven't failed yet. I'm going to. Maybe. But not tonight. Tonight we're still here, still fighting." He looked up at her. His face was wet. His eyes were raw. He looked nothing like the confident rancher who'd proposed a marriage of convenience. He looked like what he was, a man at the end of his rope, holding on by his fingernails. "Why aren't you angry?" he asked. "Why aren't you blaming me?" "Because I know what it's like to fight and lose, to do everything right and still fail. Anger doesn't change that. It just makes the losing louder." For a long moment they stayed like that, her hand on his shoulder, his hand coming up slowly to cover hers, the first real touch they'd shared since signing the contract. "Margaret," he said. The name was barely a whisper. James. It was the first time she'd called him by his given name. It felt dangerous, intimate, like crossing a line they'd both been careful not to approach. The moment stretched. Tension built. Something was shifting between them, something neither had planned for or wanted or could stop. Then, from outside, a gunshot cracked the night. They broke apart. James grabbed his rifle. Maggie followed him, still in her nightclothes, pistol in hand. Outside, chaos. Men shouting, horses screaming, and in the distance, fire. The barn was burning. They ran. The cold bit through Maggie's thin robe, but she barely felt it. All she could see was the flames, orange and terrible against the black sky. Ranch hands were already fighting the fire, forming bucket brigades. But it was spreading fast, too fast. This wasn't an accident. "Someone set this," Gideon shouted over the roar. "3 riders, saw them running west." "Did you get a look?" James demanded. "Too dark, too fast." The barn couldn't be saved. They knew it within minutes. The best they could do was keep the fire from spreading to the house, to the other outbuildings. They fought until dawn. Maggie worked alongside the men, hauling water, beating back flames with wet blankets. Her hands blistered, her lungs filled with smoke. She didn't stop. When the fire finally died, when the sun rose over the wreckage, they stood in the ashes and surveyed the damage. The barn was gone. 20 tons of hay were gone. Equipment was gone. And in the wreckage, they found 3 dead horses, trapped in their stalls, unable to escape. Maggie heard a sound beside her, turned, saw James staring at the dead animals, saw his face break, saw him turn away so no one would see. But she saw. And without thinking, without calculating the cost, she followed him, found him behind the house, leaning against the wall, shoulders shaking. She put her arms around him from behind, just held him, let him break, let him grieve, let him be human. He turned in her arms, buried his face against her shoulder, and cried like a man who had forgotten how. "They're killing us," he choked out, "one piece at a time, and I can't stop them. We'll find a way. There is no way." "There's always a way, we just haven't found it yet." He pulled back, looked at her with red, raw eyes. "Why do you care? This isn't your fight. You could walk away, take your share of what's left, and go." "Could I?" Maggie asked. "Where would I go? What would I have? We're bound together now, for better or worse. Isn't that what marriage means?" "This isn't a real marriage, isn't it?" The question hung between them, unanswerable, undeniable. James reached up, touched her face. His hand was gentle, hesitant, asking permission. Maggie didn't pull away. He leaned in. She let him. Their lips met, soft and desperate and inevitable. The kiss lasted only a moment, but in that moment everything changed. When they broke apart, when reality returned, they stood in the cold morning light, covered in ash and soot, staring at each other like strangers who'd just recognized something they'd been trying to ignore. "This complicates things," James said. "Yes." "We should probably talk about it." "Yes." Neither of them moved. Neither wanted to break whatever fragile thing had just formed between them. Then Gideon's voice called out, "Boss, Sheriff's here." They returned to the front of the house. Sheriff Clayton Hayes sat on his horse, looking at the burnt barn with an expression of false sympathy. "Heard you had some trouble," he said. "Trouble?" James's voice was flat. "Is that what we're calling arson now?" "Now, Mr. Holloway, that's a serious accusation. Do you have proof it was arson? 3 riders, seen by my men, racing away right after the fire started." "Description?" "Too dark to see clearly." Hayes spread his hands. "Then I don't know what you want me to do. Could have been drifters. Vagrant. Someone warming themselves who got careless. At 2 in the morning, in the middle of my property? Stranger things have happened." Hayes tipped his hat. "I'll look into it, of course, but without witnesses or evidence, my hands are tied." He rode away. His message was clear. They were on their own. The law wouldn't help them. Couldn't help them. Or wouldn't. James turned to Maggie. His face was hard now, resolved. "We have 2 choices," he said. "Run or fight." "I don't run. Neither do I. Then we fight. Even though we'll probably lose?" "Especially then." He almost smiled. "Would have, if the circumstances had been different." "All right, Mrs. Holloway. We fight, but we fight smart. We need leverage, information, something Drake doesn't expect." Maggie thought about Lucia, about the quiet housekeeper who saw everything, heard everything, about the way she'd looked when she warned Maggie about James's past, like a woman carrying secrets. "I might know where to start," Maggie said. That afternoon, she found Lucia in the kitchen, asked her to sit, took her hands. "Lucia," Maggie said gently, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Lucia's eyes filled with tears. "I am so sorry, Señora." "Sorry for what?" And then, in a rush of Spanish and English mixed together, Lucia confessed. About Drake's threats, about her son Miguel, undocumented and vulnerable, about the letters she'd been sending to town, reporting on the Holloway situation, about being trapped between loyalty and love, between right and survival. "He said he would have Miguel deported," Lucia sobbed. "He said I would never see him again. I had no choice. Please, you must believe me. I had no choice." Maggie held her while she cried, felt her own heart breaking for this woman, this mother caught in Drake's web. "You had a choice," Maggie said softly. "You chose your son. I understand that. Any mother would." "You do not hate me?" "No, I hate the man who put you in this position." Maggie pulled back, looked Lucia in the eyes. "But now you have another choice. You can keep helping Drake, or you can help us destroy him." Lucia wiped her eyes. "How?" "By telling him what we want him to know, by feeding him lies instead of truth. Can you do that?" Lucia thought for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, for Mr. Holloway, for you, and for Miguel, so he can be free of this man's shadow. It might be dangerous. Everything is dangerous now." That night they made a plan. Lucia would continue sending reports to Drake, but the reports would be false. They'd make it seem like the Holloways were weaker than they were, more desperate, more likely to sell. Meanwhile, James would reach out to old contacts, try to find proof of Drake's involvement in the cattle theft and arson, try to find other victims willing to testify. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. 2 weeks passed. The weather got worse. The ranch struggled to function without a barn. Cattle died. Men left, finding work elsewhere. The walls closed in. But Maggie and James worked side by side, closer now, touching more. Not quite lovers, but not quite business partners either. Something in between. Something without a name. One night James found Maggie in the library. She was reading by firelight. He sat beside her, took her hand. "When this is over," he said, "however it ends, I want you to know something." "What?" "This stopped being just business for me. Sometime between the contract and now, you became more than a solution to a problem. You became someone I need." Maggie's throat tightened. "James?" "You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know." But Maggie did have something to say, something she'd been holding back, something dangerous and true. "It stopped being just business for me, too." He kissed her then, not desperate this time, tender, full of promise and fear and hope. When they finally pulled apart, the fire had burned low. Winter howled outside, but in that moment, in that room, they were warm. They didn't see the shadow at the window, didn't see the figure watching them, taking note, reporting back. Drake's spy, the one they hadn't found, the one they didn't know existed, the one who would change everything. The letter arrived on a morning that started like any other. Cold, gray. The kind of December dawn that made you question whether the sun would ever truly rise again. Maggie was in the kitchen with Lucia, kneading bread dough. Her hands had learned the rhythm of it now, the push and fold and turn that transformed flour and water into something that could sustain life. It was meditative work, peaceful, in a world that had forgotten peace. The door burst open. Gideon stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, his face carved from stone. "Mrs. Holloway, boss needs you, now." Maggie wiped flour from her hands. "What's wrong?" "Just come." She found James in his study, standing at the window, a piece of paper clutched in his fist. His shoulders were rigid. When he turned, his face was white. "What is it?" Maggie asked. He handed her the paper without speaking. It was a foreclosure notice. Final. Irrevocable. They had 2 weeks to vacate the property. Both properties. Everything they owned, gone. "How?" Maggie's voice came out strangled. "We made the last payment. We've been careful." "Read the bottom." She did. Her blood turned to ice. Due to ongoing violations of livestock welfare clauses in the loan agreement and failure to maintain minimum herd numbers as stipulated in Contract Amendment 47B, Iron Valley Bank hereby exercises its right to immediate foreclosure. Amendment 47B, Maggie said slowly. "What amendment?" "The one I apparently signed." James's laugh was bitter. "Along with the variable rate increase. Another forgery. Another clause I never agreed to that says if my herd drops below a certain number, the bank can take everything immediately. How many are we short?" 15 head, that's all. 15 animals between us and ruin." Maggie sat down heavily. 2 weeks, 14 days. After everything they'd fought for, everything they'd survived, it came down to this. A piece of paper with a forged signature and a deadline that might as well have been tomorrow. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "Like what?" "We've tried everything. We've contacted lawyers who won't take the case without money up front. We've talked to other ranchers who are too scared of Drake to testify. We've looked for proof we can't find. Then we find different proof. Or we create it." James shook his head. "You can't fight fraud with fraud, Margaret. That just makes us criminals, too. Better criminals than corpses." The words hung in the air, harsh, true, unforgivable. Before James could respond, Lucia appeared in the doorway. Her face was ashen. "Senor Holloway, Senora, I must tell you something. Something terrible." They both turned. Maggie felt dread settle in her stomach like a stone. "What is it, Lucia?" James asked gently. "I have been a fool. A blind, stupid fool." Tears streamed down Lucia's face. "I thought I was the only one Drake was using, but there is another. Someone else in this house who has been reporting to him. Someone I trusted." "Who?" Maggie demanded. "I do not know for certain, but yesterday I saw something. Gideon, in town, talking to a man I recognized, one of Drake's men. They were in the alley behind the bank. Gideon gave him papers, documents." The world tilted. Maggie reached for the desk to steady herself. Gideon, James's foreman. The man who'd been with him for over a decade. The man who knew every detail of their operation, every weakness, every plan. James's face had gone from white to gray. "No, not Gideon. He wouldn't." "I saw it, senor. I am certain." "There could be an explanation." "Yes, the explanation is betrayal." James sat down slowly, like an old man, like someone whose bones had forgotten how to hold weight. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would he do this?" Maggie's mind was racing. Gideon had been present for every conversation, every plan. He'd known about Lucia's false reports to Drake. Had known they were trying to gather evidence. had known everything they were going to do before they did it. No wonder they'd failed. They'd been sabotaged from the inside. "We need to confront him," Maggie said. "And say what? Accuse him based on Lucia seeing him talk to someone? He'll deny it. We need proof. Then we get proof." That night Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, mind churning. 2 weeks. Gideon's betrayal, Drake's web closing around them. Every path forward seemed to end in the same place. Loss, ruin, the death of everything they'd tried to build. Around midnight she heard footsteps in the hall. Quiet, careful, someone trying not to be heard. She rose, took her pistol, followed. The footsteps led downstairs, to James's study. Maggie pressed herself against the wall, peering around the corner. Gideon was inside, going through the desk, looking for something. He found a ledger, tucked it inside his coat, and turned to leave. Maggie stepped into the doorway, raised her pistol. Her hand was steady. "Going somewhere, Gideon?" He froze, turned slowly. His face was calm, not surprised, not guilty, just tired. "Mrs. Holloway? Put the ledger back." "I can't do that. I'm holding a gun. You're stealing. Put it back. This isn't what you think." "Then explain it. Explain why you're sneaking through James's study at midnight stealing documents. Explain why you've been meeting with Drake's men. Explain why you've been betraying the man who trusted you." Gideon's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he might rush her, might try to take the gun. But instead he sank into a chair, shoulders slumping. "You want an explanation? Fine. My wife is dying. Cancer. She has maybe 6 months left, and those months are going to be agony unless she gets treatment. Real treatment, not the quackery that passes for medicine out here. Treatment that costs more money than I'll make in 5 years. Maggie's finger eased off the trigger, just slightly. "Drake offered to pay for it," Gideon continued. His voice was hollow. "All of it. The doctors, the medicine, everything. All I had to do was keep him informed, tell him what the boss was planning, make sure certain things went wrong at the right times." "So you cut the fences, poisoned the water, started the fire?" "No." Gideon looked up, and his eyes were fierce. "I gave information. I didn't do the dirty work myself. That was Drake's men. I just told them when and where to strike." "That's a distinction without a difference." "Maybe, but it's the distinction that lets me sleep at night. Or would if I slept at all anymore." "You're killing James. You know that, right? You're destroying a good man to save your wife." "I know," Gideon's voice cracked. "You think I don't know? You think I'm not in hell every single day? But what would you do, Mrs. Holloway? What would you sacrifice to save someone you love?" The question hit like a fist, because Maggie knew the answer. She'd already sacrificed Frank, had let him die, maybe even helped him die, because saving him would have cost her the last shred of her soul. "Does James know?" she asked quietly. "No, he can't know. Drake said if I tell anyone, the deal is off. Clara dies, and it's all for nothing." Footsteps sounded behind Maggie. She turned. James stood there, still in his nightclothes, face unreadable. "How long have you been there?" Maggie asked. "Long enough." James moved into the room, looked at Gideon. "Clara's sick?" Gideon nodded, unable to speak. "Cancer?" Another nod. James crossed to his desk, opened a drawer, pulled out a checkbook, began writing. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked hoarsely. "Paying for Clara's treatment." James tore off the check, held it out. "This should cover the first round. I'll arrange more as needed." Gideon stared at the check like it was a snake. "I don't understand. I betrayed you. I helped destroy you." "I know, and you're going to fix it." "How?" "By telling me everything. Every conversation with Drake. Every piece of information you gave him. Every plan he has. And then you're going to help me destroy him. He'll kill Clara if I turn on him. He's not going to know you turned. You're going to keep feeding him information. But from now on, that information is going to be what we want him to know. You're going to be our weapon, Gideon, our spy." Understanding dawned in Gideon's eyes, then doubt. He'll figure it out. Not if we're careful, not if we play this right. And if we're not careful, if he realizes, Then we all go down together, but at least we go down fighting." Gideon took the check with unsteady fingers, looked at it, then at James, then at Maggie. "Why?" he whispered. "Why help me after what I've done?" James's expression was sad, tired, but not without mercy. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone. I lost Rebecca. I lost my daughter. If I'd had a choice, if there'd been anything I could have done to save them, I would have betrayed anyone, anything, even myself. So I understand, Gideon. I don't forgive you, but I understand." Gideon put his face in his hands and wept. Gideon put his face in his hands and wept. When his tears finally stopped, Maggie spoke quietly. "I want to meet her." Gideon's head jerked up. "What?" "Your wife, Clara. I want to meet her. If I'm going to trust you, if we're going to work together, I need to understand what you're fighting for. She's very sick. She shouldn't be disturbed." "Then we'll be quiet." The next morning, before dawn, Gideon led Maggie to a small cabin at the far edge of Holloway property. Maggie hadn't even known it was there. The cabin was humble but clean, a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, the air smelled of sickness, masked by lavender. Clara Fletcher lay in bed, propped on pillows, a quilt pulled to her chest. She'd once been beautiful. You could see it in the bones of her face, the shape of her eyes. But illness had carved her down to something fragile and translucent. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds. When she saw Maggie, Clara tried to sit up straighter. "Mrs. Holloway, forgive me. I'd rise to greet you properly, but I'm afraid my legs have forgotten how." "Please don't." Maggie pulled a chair close to the bed, sat, took Clara's hand without asking permission. The bones felt like bird wings under paper skin. "Gideon told me," Clara said softly, "what he's been doing, what Drake forced him to do. I begged him to stop, told him I'd rather die with dignity than live knowing a good man was destroyed for my sake." Her eyes, still bright despite everything, filled with tears. But he wouldn't listen. He said he'd already lost too much in this life. He couldn't lose me, too. "He loves you." "I know, and it's killing us both. The disease is killing my body. His guilt is killing his soul." Clara's grip tightened slightly, surprising strength in such frail fingers. "Don't hate him, Mrs. Holloway. He's a good man caught in an impossible situation. We're all just trying to survive the winter, aren't we?" Maggie felt her throat tighten. She saw herself in Clara, saw every woman who'd ever been trapped by circumstance, every person forced to make terrible choices for understandable reasons. "I don't hate him," Maggie said. "I understand him. And that's worse because I don't know if I'd do anything different in his place." Clara smiled. It was tired, but genuine. "You're stronger than you think, Mrs. Holloway. Gideon says you frighten him a little, says you have fire in you that won't go out, no matter how hard the wind blows. Right now I feel like I'm barely a spark. Sparks start fires, remember that." When Maggie left the cabin, James was waiting outside, leaning against the porch rail. He'd given her space, but hadn't gone far. "You met her," he said. Not a question. "Yes. And?" "And she's dying. And she's kind. And Gideon's right to fight for her." Maggie looked at James, really looked at him. "If it were me dying, if you had to choose between betraying someone and saving me, what would you do?" James was quiet for a long moment. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Finally he said, "I'd like to think I'd find another way, that I'd be better than betrayal. But standing here, looking at you, knowing what I'd feel if I lost you." He shook his head. "I don't know, and that terrifies me." "Me too." They stood together in the cold morning, two people who'd learned that the world was rarely as simple as right and wrong. Sometimes it was just varying shades of survival. They worked through the night, the three of them. Gideon told them everything. Drake's network of informants, his connections with corrupt officials, his plans for the railroad. The scope of his operation was staggering. He'd been systematically destroying ranchers all along the proposed route for over a year. But he'd also been sloppy, arrogant. He'd left trails. Gideon had names, dates, amounts. Not enough for a court case, perhaps, but enough for leverage. "There's something else," Gideon said as dawn broke. Drake's been in contact with someone from the territorial government, someone with influence. I don't know who, but they've been meeting regularly, planning something big. Can you find out who? James asked. Maybe. Drake keeps records in his office at the bank, second floor, locked safe behind the painting of his father. You've seen inside the safe? Once. When Drake thought I was completely under his control, he showed me. Said it was insurance. If anyone ever came after him, he'd take half the territory down with him. Maggie leaned forward. What's in there? Documents? Blackmail material? Proof of bribes, forged contracts, illegal land deals? Everything he's done for the last 5 years, all documented. He's paranoid, keeps records of everything. Why would he keep evidence of his own crimes? Because it's not just his crimes in there. It's everyone he's worked with, every official he's bribed, every judge he's bought. If he goes down, they all go down. It's his guarantee they'll protect him. James and Maggie exchanged glances. The safe was their answer, their leverage, their way out. It was also impossible to reach. Drake's office was in the middle of town. The bank was guarded at night. Even if they could get inside, cracking the safe would take time and skill they didn't have. We need help, Maggie said. From who? James asked. Everyone's too scared of Drake. Not everyone. That afternoon, Maggie rode to town alone. James wanted to accompany her, but she insisted. What she was planning required a woman's touch, a woman's understanding. She went to the Chinese laundry first, found Mrs. Chen in the back, sorting dirty linens. The old woman looked up when Maggie entered. Her eyes were wary. Mrs. Holloway, what you want? I want to talk about Cornelius Drake, about what he did to you. Mrs. Chen's face closed. I have nothing to say. He took your building, the one you worked 30 years to buy. He gave you a loan you couldn't repay, then took everything when you defaulted. This is old news, water under bridge. What if I told you we could get it back? What if I told you we could make Drake pay for what he did? Not just to you, to everyone. Mrs. Chen set down the laundry, studied Maggie with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. How? By standing together, by refusing to be afraid anymore. Fear keeps us alive. No, fear keeps us breathing. That's not the same as alive. Mrs. Chen considered this, then nodded slowly. What you need. Your voice, your story, and your willingness to testify to what Drake did. He will destroy me. He's already destroyed you. What more can he take? The logic was brutal, undeniable. Mrs. Chen's lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. You are a brave woman, Mrs. Holloway, or very stupid. I have not decided which. Can I be both? Yes, I think this is possible. Mrs. Chen wiped her hands on her apron. Who else you have? Not enough, but I'm working on it. Next, Maggie visited Samuel Gray's ranch. The black rancher was outside mending a fence. He straightened when she approached, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle leaning against a post. Easy, Mr. Gray. I'm not here for trouble. Then what are you here for? Justice. He laughed. It was a hard sound. Justice? For people like me? In a territory like this? You're dreaming, Mrs. Holloway. Maybe, but I'm also fighting. Against Cornelius Drake, and I need allies. Gray's expression changed, became cautious, interested. Drake, huh? What did he do to you? Tried to take everything I have, same as he did to you. He tell you I was uppity, that I didn't know my place? He didn't need to, I can imagine. Can you? Gray's voice was sharp. Can you really imagine what it's like to be denied a loan because of the color of your skin? To be told you're not worthy of credit? Not worthy of land, not worthy of basic human dignity? No, Maggie said honestly, I can't. But I know what it's like to be treated as less than human for other reasons, to be beaten and broken and told you deserved it. I know what it's like to survive despite a world that wants you dead, and I know what it's like to be too tired to keep fighting alone. Gray studied her for a long moment, then he nodded. What's your plan? Expose him. Publicly, make it impossible for him to hide behind his money and his connections. You'll need more than accusations. I know, I'm working on that too. Count me in. It could be dangerous. Mrs. Holloway, being black in Wyoming territory is dangerous. At least this way, I'm dangerous back. By evening, Maggie had visited 6 families. 6 people Drake had wronged. Not all of them agreed to help. Fear was a powerful motivator, but enough did. Enough to form the core of something that might, with luck and courage, become a movement. She returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, found James in the barn feeding the horses. He looked up when she entered, and the relief on his face was almost painful to see. "I was worried," he said. "I'm fine, and I have allies." She told him everything, the people she'd talked to, the stories they'd shared, the willingness to stand up despite the fear. When she finished, James pulled her close, held her against his chest. She could hear his heart beating, fast and hard. "You're remarkable," he murmured against her hair. "Do you know that?" "I'm desperate. There's a difference." "No, you're brave. There's a difference." She pulled back to look at him. His face was shadowed in the dim light of the barn, but his eyes were clear, warm, full of something that made her chest ache. "James," she said, "whatever happens, whatever comes next, I need you to know something." "What?" "This stopped being about survival for me. This stopped being about the ranch or the land or any of it. This is about you now, about us, about not letting them win." He cupped her face in his hands, kissed her, soft at first, then deeper. A kiss that tasted like hope and desperation and something that might have been love if either of them had been brave enough to name it. They broke apart when they heard footsteps. Lucia stood in the barn doorway, wringing her hands. Senora, Gideon has returned. He has news." They found Gideon in the house, pacing. His face was flushed, his eyes bright, with something that looked like triumph. "I found out who Drake's been meeting with," he said without preamble, "and it's bigger than we thought." "Who?" James demanded. "Judge Morrison. He's the one who approved all of Drake's foreclosures, signed off on the forged contracts. He's been in Drake's pocket for years." Maggie felt her stomach drop. Judge Morrison was one of the most powerful men in the territory. If he was involved, this went far beyond one corrupt banker. "There's more," Gideon continued. "Drake's planning something, a meeting, tomorrow night, at the bank. All his major investors, his political connections, everyone who's been helping him. He's going to divide up the land once the railroad deal goes through. It's a celebration, a victory party." "How do you know this?" "Because I'm invited. He wants me there to report on your final status, to confirm you've been broken completely." James and Maggie exchanged glances. Tomorrow night, a room full of corrupt officials and criminals, all of Drake's allies in one place. "That's our chance," Maggie said. "That's when we move." "Move how?" Gideon asked. "We still don't have proof. We can't get into the safe." "Then we don't get into the safe." Maggie's mind was racing, pieces falling into place. "We get Drake to open it." "How?" "By making him think he's won. By making him so confident, so arrogant, that he wants to show off, to prove his power." James caught on immediately. "We go to the meeting, not as victims, as partners. We offer to sell, make it look like we're surrendering." "Exactly. And while everyone's distracted, celebrating their victory, someone gets into Drake's office, gets the evidence, and brings it straight to the marshal." "The marshal won't help us," Gideon said. "We tried that already." "Not Marshal Barnes. He's bought." Maggie smiled, sharp as a knife. "But there's a federal marshal passing through Cheyenne. Name's Elizabeth Cordell. She's investigating territorial corruption. If we can get evidence to her, she'll act." "How do you know about her?" "Mrs. Chen told me. Marshal Cordell helped her nephew last year with a land dispute. She's honest, incorruptible. The exact opposite of everyone Drake has in his pocket." "And how do we get evidence to Cheyenne?" "It's a 2-day ride. The meeting's tomorrow night." "We send someone now, tonight, with copies of everything Gideon's told us. It won't be enough to convict Drake, but it'll be enough to get Marshal Cordell's attention. Enough to make her come investigate." "Who do we send?" Maggie turned to Lucia. "Your son, Miguel. Can he ride?" Lucia's eyes widened. "Yes, he is an excellent rider. But why would you trust him?" "Because he has the most to gain from Drake's downfall. Because he's young and fast and unknown. Because Drake won't be watching for him. It is dangerous. Everything is dangerous now. Lucia nodded slowly. I will ask him. But the choice must be his. Miguel arrived an hour later. He was 20, lean and quick, with his mother's dark eyes and a wariness that came from living in the shadows. Maggie explained the plan, explained the risk. If I do this, Miguel said slowly, if I help you, will you help me? Will you sponsor me? Give me papers that say I have a right to be here. Yes, James said immediately. You have my word. The word of a man about to lose everything. The word of a man who keeps his promises, even when it costs him. Miguel looked at his mother. She nodded, eyes shining with tears and pride. Then I will ride, Miguel said. For you, for my mother, and for everyone Drake has hurt. They spent the night preparing. Miguel left 3 days before Drake's planned celebration. He departed at midnight, carrying documents and testimony carefully wrapped in oilcloth. His horse was their fastest, his path planned to avoid Drake's watchers. Through Mrs. Chen, Maggie had learned that Marshal Elizabeth Cordell was already in Cheyenne investigating territorial corruption. Miguel's mission wasn't to start an investigation, but to provide the final evidence the marshal needed to act. The wait was agonizing. 3 days of not knowing if Miguel had made it safely, if the marshal believed him, if they were walking into Drake's celebration with federal backup or into an elaborate trap with no escape. James checked the roads obsessively. Maggie caught herself listening for hoofbeats that never came. They had committed everything to this gamble. If Miguel failed, if the marshal didn't come, they would face Drake's wrath with nothing to protect them. On the third night they prepared for the meeting. Still no word from Cheyenne. Still no sign of the marshal. We go anyway, James said, even if she doesn't come. Even if we're alone. We finish this. Maggie nodded. They'd come too far to turn back now. The rest of them prepared for the meeting. Maggie dressed in her best clothes, the ones she'd worn to marry James. She pinned her hair up, made herself look respectable, defeated, ready to surrender. James wore his suit, the expensive one, the one that said he was still a man of means, even if he was a man about to lose everything. They looked at themselves in the mirror, looked at each other. Are you ready? James asked. No, but I'm going anyway. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, if Drake figures out what we're doing, if things turn violent, I need you to promise me something. What? Run. Don't try to save me. Don't be heroic. Just run. Maggie turned to face him fully. I can't promise that. Margaret, I can't. Because I love you. And I'm not leaving you to face this alone. The words hung in the air between them. The first time either had said it. The first time they'd acknowledged what had been growing between them all these months. James closed his eyes. You picked the worst times to say that. Would you prefer I waited until we were dead? He laughed. Actually laughed. Then pulled her close. Kissed her like it might be the last time. I love you too, he whispered. God help me, I love you too. They arrived at the bank just after dark. The building was lit up like a celebration. Carriages lined the street. Well-dressed men and women climbed the steps, laughing, confident. Inside, the meeting room was crowded. Maggie recognized faces. Judge Morrison, several city councilmen, ranch owners who'd bought foreclosed properties at Drake's auctions. The whole corrupt ecosystem that kept men like Drake in power. Drake himself stood at the head of the room holding court. When he saw James and Maggie enter, his smile widened. Ah, the Holloways. How good of you to come. We're here to discuss terms, James said. His voice was flat, defeated, perfect. Terms of surrender, I assume. Terms of sale. You want our land. We're ready to sell. The room went quiet. Drake's smile became sharper, hungrier. I'm listening. Not here, in your office. This is a private matter. Drake considered, then nodded. Of course. Gentlemen, ladies, please excuse me. This won't take long. They followed him upstairs. Gideon came too, playing his role as loyal foreman. Drake's office was exactly as Gideon had described. Large desk, expensive furnishings. and on the wall a painting of an older man with Drake's eyes. Drake sat behind his desk, gestured for them to sit. They remained standing. "So," Drake said, "you're finally accepting reality. I admit I'm surprised. I thought you'd fight to the bitter end." "We did fight," James said. "We lost. Now we just want to salvage what we can." "Very practical. I can respect that." Drake pulled out papers. "I'll give you $5,000 for both properties. That's generous, given your situation. The land is worth 10 times that. The land is worth what I say it's worth, 5,000. Take it or leave it." "We'll take it," Maggie said, "on one condition, which is, we want to see the railroad contract, proof that the railroad is actually coming, that this isn't just speculation." Drake's eyes narrowed. "Why would you need to see that?" "Because if the railroad isn't coming, your offer is worthless. We want assurance." "You're in no position to demand assurance." "Then we walk. You can foreclose. Take the land, but you'll spend months in legal battles. The railroad might move their route. Your investors will get nervous, or you can show us the contract, we sign your papers, and everyone walks away happy." Drake drummed his fingers on the desk. Outside, the party continued. Laughter, music, the sound of people who thought they'd already won. Finally, Drake stood, went to the painting, swung it aside. The safe was there, large, steel. Exactly as Gideon had described. Drake spun the combination, opened it. Inside, Maggie could see stacks of documents, files, evidence. Drake pulled out a single paper, the railroad contract, held it up. "Satisfied? May I?" Maggie reached for it. Drake hesitated, then handed it over. "Don't get any ideas, Mrs. Holloway. That's the only copy in this room. The original is filed with the territorial government." Maggie pretended to read the contract. Her eyes, however, were on the safe, on the files inside, on the evidence they needed. Behind Drake, Gideon caught her eye, nodded slightly. He'd seen it too. "This seems legitimate," Maggie said, handing the contract back. "Of course it's legitimate. Now shall we sign?" "One more thing," James said. "I'd like Gideon to witness. He's been with me for years. I want him to know I made the right choice, that I did everything I could." It was a gamble, a huge gamble, but Drake nodded. "Fine. Fletcher, come here. Bear witness to your boss's surrender." Gideon moved closer to the desk, closer to the safe, which was still open. While Drake laid out the sale documents, Gideon's hand moved, fast, practiced. He pulled a file from the safe, slipped it inside his coat. The whole movement took 2 seconds, maybe less. Drake didn't notice. He was too focused on the papers, too confident, too certain of his victory. "Sign here," Drake said, pointing. "And here." James picked up the pen. Maggie held her breath. Then the door burst open. A man stood there, breathless, one of Drake's associates. "Sir, we have a problem. Federal marshal just arrived. She's asking questions. About you. About foreclosures. She has a witness with her. Some Mexican kid who rode from Holloway Ranch." Drake's face went white, then red. He turned to James and Maggie. Understanding dawned. "You," he hissed. "You set me up." "No," James said calmly. "You set yourself up. We just made sure everyone found out about it." Drake lunged for the safe, saw the missing file, turned to Gideon. You betrayed me." "No," Gideon said. "I stopped betraying the people I actually care about. There's a difference." Drake's hand went to his desk drawer. Maggie knew what was there. Gun. She moved fast, grabbed the letter opener from the desk, held it like a knife. "Don't," she said quietly. Drake froze. They stood there, locked in a tableau. Then footsteps sounded on the stairs. Many footsteps. Official footsteps. A woman entered, 50 maybe. Hard eyes. Federal marshal's badge on her chest. "Cornelius Drake," she said. "I'm Marshal Elizabeth Cordell. I have a warrant for your arrest." The next hour was chaos. Drake was taken into custody, his associates scattered. The party downstairs broke up in a panic as people tried to distance themselves from the suddenly toxic banker. Judge Morrison was arrested too. 2 city councilmen, a territorial land agent. The scope of the corruption was staggering. Marshal Cordell interviewed James and Maggie in Drake's office. Gideon handed over the file he'd stolen. Inside were the documents they needed, proof of forgery, proof of bribery, proof of everything Drake had done. "This is good," Cordell said, flipping through papers. "This is very good. You've handed me the biggest corruption case in territorial history." "What happens now?" Maggie asked. "Trials. Investigations. It'll take months, maybe years, but Drake and everyone he worked with will face justice." "And our land?" "The foreclosure is invalid. Forged documents, illegal clauses. The bank will have to restore your properties. You'll get everything back." Maggie felt James's hand find hers, squeeze. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd won. "There's one more thing," Cordell said. "I need you to testify, both of you, and everyone else Drake hurt. This case needs witnesses." "We'll testify," James said. "All of us." They left the bank as dawn was breaking, stepped into a world that felt different, lighter. The weight they'd been carrying for months was finally gone. On the street, Mrs. Chen waited. Samuel Gray, Father Domenico, all the people Maggie had recruited, all the people who'd been brave enough to stand up. "Is it over?" Mrs. Chen asked. "It's over," Maggie said. "We won." The celebration was quiet, exhausted, but real. They'd faced down a powerful man and his corrupt system. And they'd won. Not because they were stronger, not because they were richer, but because they'd refused to give up, because they'd stood together. 6 months later, spring came to Wyoming territory. The snow melted. Green grass pushed through the thawed earth. Life returned. Maggie stood on the porch of Holloway Ranch, watching the sunrise. Her ranch. Their ranch. Legal? Legitimate. Theirs. James came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That a year ago I was alone, desperate, ready to die, and now I'm here, with you, with a future." "Regrets?" "About marrying you? No. About everything that came after? Also, no. We earned this, James. We earned every bit of it." "What do we do now?" "Now, we live, we ranch. We grow old together. We do all the boring, mundane things people do when they're not fighting for their lives." "Sounds perfect." Below them, in the valley, construction had begun. The railroad was coming. But this time, it was coming on their terms. The land would be theirs. The future would be theirs. Lucia emerged from the house carrying coffee. Miguel was with her, legal now, documented, no longer living in fear. He was working as a ranch hand, learning the trade, building a life. Gideon was there too. Clara had survived. The treatment had worked. She was weak but alive, and Gideon watched over her like she was made of spun glass. He'd never apologized for his betrayal, but he'd spent 6 months proving his loyalty in actions instead of words. That was enough. Mrs. Chen had her building back. Samuel Gray had his dignity. Father Domenico had his church land. All the people Drake had hurt were being made whole again. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. All the people Drake had hurt were being made whole again. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The Sunday after Drake's sentencing, Maggie and James attended church. The first time they'd shown their faces in town since the trial began. Maggie's stomach churned as they climbed the church steps. She could feel eyes on them, hear the whispers. Even in victory, judgment followed her like a shadow. They took their seats near the back. The pew was hard. The air smelled of old wood and candle wax. Conversations died when they entered, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Father Domenico began the service. His voice was strong, certain. Today's scripture comes from the story of David and Goliath, a shepherd boy who faced a giant everyone said was unbeatable. Maggie kept her eyes forward, refused to look around, refused to see who was watching. "We've all faced giants in our lives," Father Domenico continued. "Giants of fear, giants of injustice, giants that tell us we're too small, too weak, too ordinary to fight back." His voice grew stronger. "This week, this community witnessed something remarkable. We saw what happens when ordinary people find extraordinary courage, when they refuse to be silent, when they stand together against power that seems insurmountable. He looked directly at James and Maggie. "We saw what happens when we stop being afraid." Mrs. Chen stood. The movement was sudden, decisive. She began to clap, slowly, deliberately, each clap echoing in the silent church. Samuel Gray rose, joined her. Then Father Domenico himself stepped down from the pulpit, applauding. One by one the congregation stood, some quickly, some reluctantly. But they stood, they clapped. Not because the Holloways were perfect, not because victory erased their struggles, but because they'd fought, and won, and proven that winning was possible. Maggie's vision blurred. She felt James's hand find hers, squeezed tight. "We did this together," he whispered. "All of us." When the applause finally faded, when the service resumed, something had shifted. The Holloways weren't outsiders anymore. They weren't just survivors. They were part of something larger, a community that had learned finally to protect its own. The trials had been long. The trial had concluded 3 months after Drake's arrest. Federal charges meant a federal court, far from the reach of territorial corruption. The evidence Gideon had stolen from Drake's safe proved devastating. Forged documents, records of bribes, a ledger tracking every illegal land deal for 5 years. Drake received 20 years in Deer Lodge Territorial Prison. He'd be an old man when he emerged, if he emerged at all. Men like Drake didn't last long in places like that. Judge Morrison was disbarred and sentenced to 10 years. 2 city councilmen resigned rather than face prosecution, their reputations destroyed. The territorial land agent who'd helped Drake fled to California and was never found. Several smaller accomplices received fines and jail time. The stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners. Forged contracts were nullified. The bank was placed under federal oversight, its assets frozen until a new management team could be appointed. The railroad deal was renegotiated, this time with fair prices, honest terms, legal contracts that didn't require anyone to lose their livelihood. It wasn't perfect justice. Some of Drake's accomplices had escaped. Some victims could never be fully compensated for what they'd lost. Years of suffering couldn't be erased by courtroom victories. But it was more justice than anyone had dared hope for. It was proof that power could be challenged, that corruption could be exposed, that ordinary people working together could change a system that seemed designed to crush them. The system had been shaken. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. A young couple rode up the drive, newlyweds by the look of them. They dismounted, approached the porch nervously. "Mr. and Mrs. Holloway," the young man said, "we heard you might be selling part of your land. We're looking to start a ranch, start a life together." Maggie looked at James. He nodded. "We might have something available," Maggie said. "Tell us your story." As the young couple talked, as they shared their hopes and dreams and plans, Maggie felt something shift inside her. This was legacy. This was purpose. This was what they'd fought for. Not just their own survival, but the chance to help others survive too. When the couple left, promising to return with financial details, James pulled Maggie close. "You know what I think?" he said. "What?" "I think we should make this marriage official, not a business arrangement, not a contract, a real marriage, a real partnership, forever. James Holloway, are you proposing to me again?" "I am. And this time, I'm doing it right. Margaret Ann Sullivan Holloway, I love you. I've loved you since you stood in your market stall and told me to go to hell. I've loved you through every fight, every setback, every moment of this terrible, wonderful year. Will you stay married to me? Not because you have to, but because you want to." Maggie smiled. It was a real smile, the kind she'd forgotten how to make during her years with Frank, the kind that came from joy instead of performance. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll stay married to you. Yes, I'll build this life with you. Yes to all of it." They kissed as the sun climbed higher, as the land warmed around them, as winter finally, truly ended. That evening they gathered everyone for dinner, Lucia and Miguel, Gideon and Clara, the ranch hands, Mrs. Chen, Samuel Gray, Father Domenico, everyone who'd fought beside them, everyone who'd survived. Maggie stood at the head of the table, raised her glass. "A toast," she said. "To winter, to surviving it, to each other, to the family we've built, not through blood, but through choice, through loyalty, through love." "To winter," they echoed, "and to spring." They drank, they ate, they laughed. They told stories of the battle they'd won and the battles still to come. Because there would be more battles. Life was never simple. But at least now, they'd face those battles together. Later, after everyone had gone, after the house was quiet, James and Maggie sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. "Do you remember what you said that first night?" James asked. "When I proposed?" "I said a lot of things. You said if I ever raised my hand to you, you'd kill me. I remember. I want you to know. You'll never need to. I'll spend the rest of my life proving you can trust me, that you're safe with me, that I'm not him." Maggie turned to look at him, touched his face. "I know. I've known for months. You're nothing like Frank. You're everything he should have been and never could be. I'm going to make you happy, Margaret, I promise. You already have." Outside the wind blew, but it was a spring wind now, warm, full of promise. The kind of wind that carried seeds and hope instead of ice and death. Iron winter had passed, and they'd survived it. Not just survived, thrived, together. As Maggie fell asleep that night, safe and warm in James's arms, she thought about the woman she'd been a year ago. Alone, afraid, convinced she was too old, too broken, too tired to start again. That woman had been wrong. It was never too late to fight, never too late to love, never too late to choose life over mere survival. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was James's heartbeat. Steady, strong, alive. And she smiled. The end.